Welcome to the Draw Podcast. I'm your host, Kimberly Mosley. Recently, I caught up with Ronit Ghose, head of the future of finance on the Global Insights team at Citi, about advancements in AI, what they mean for Citi and the Middle East and Africa. Let's get into our latest drop. Welcome, Ronit. Welcome to the Draw Podcast. It is so great to have you here with us. We are here in our Dubai office, and you're here to tell us a little bit about our most recent GPS report.
Thank you for having me.
Ronit, tell us, 30 seconds or less, what is Agentic AI, and how is it different from some of the other forms of AI people might be more familiar with, like ChatGPT?
Sure.
Yep.
So what is AI? AI is a machine that imitates a human, a piece of software that imitates a human. Generative AI, i.e. ChatGPT, we've had now a couple of years. Generative AI is like Google. It shows me something. Show it to me. Agentic AI or AI and agents is do it for me.
Okay.
So it's action, and it can be autonomous or semi-autonomous. And that's how it's different to Gen AI.
For a bank like Citi, what does it mean for us, and what does it mean for our clients?
So on my phone, on your phone as
Yeah.
well, I guess, you'll have lots of apps.
Yep.
So for every action you could take, you have an app. So there's typically 4 or 5 finance apps. There are productivity apps, there are travel apps, there are social apps. We will have agents for almost every app we have. So that's what we think about it like that. If you have an app, you'll have an agent to do that. So in financial services, or any kind of information management job, if you've got an app or a workflow, you'll have an agent either replacing it or augmenting it.
So does that make things easier for our clients? Does it complicate things for us?
You're going to have an assistant, and you're not going to need to be a trillionaire or a billionaire to have an assistant.
Yeah, that sounds great to me.
You're think about all those things that we need to get done, and we just don't have time to get done.
Yeah.
The Wi-Fi is not working. Can someone please check the Wi-Fi? The credit card needs updating or paying. The mortgage is coming due. You're coming off your discount rate. I need to go and do some research and look into what mortgage shall I replace it. Now, if I happen to be lucky enough to be a wealthy individual, someone is doing that for me. But most of us as individuals, we don't have that luxury. And the idea we write about in the report is that agents will basically it's the overused phrase, democratize. But that's what financial services has been about for the last 20, 30 years. We're bringing financial services to more and more people, and agents is part of that step. We don't have to be uber wealthy. And what agents will do is give ordinary middle-class folk access to services you need to be, or financial or otherwise, that you need to be very wealthy to do. So this should be really, really good for clients. Now, anything that's good for clients, I would argue long term is good for us as a financial service provider. But obviously in the short term, if you've built a business based on inefficiencies, that's a problem. So you have to adjust your pricing models and your business models and so on.
When people hear about AI, they often think about what that means for their jobs, right?
Yeah. There'll be there are certain things that we'll be able to hand over to agents, and there are others that we will not want to hand over to agents. So think about it in a bank. There are lots of roles that we don't want to give to a third party in a bank. We want to do it ourselves. It needs to be done in the Citi office or in our home office, but by a full-time Citi employee. And often a Citi employee we've invested a lot of money in, and we've trained them. And if you're doing that kind of job, it's unlikely an agent's going to replace you anytime soon. But maybe an agent will help you do your job.
I'm wondering, as AI systems become more agentic and more autonomous, what safeguards do we need to put in place, right?
So one of the concerns that everyone will have is, AI doing things that we haven't permissioned, like AI overriding our instructions, and so there's 2 ways of thinking about decisions. One is this decision reversible, or is it very hard to reverse? And anything that's really hard to reverse you don't want it to be autonomous AI. If it's a series of very small, let's say very small transactions, where a couple of dollars is being sent, or a few dirhams are being sent, then you'd be like, okay, I don't need to. I mean, the analogy would be like, we all have contactless cards, right? Or most of us have contactless cards. When contactless cards first came about, there was this concern about, someone could just come and tap my wallet and or I'd make a mistake by tapping when I don't mean to. So what did we do? We put a limit. It was like $50, and if it's more than $50 or $25, you have to put in a pin, and you could have those kind of safeties, security built in, so that an autonomous agent will be able to, through its linked wallet, maybe do small transactions without asking us for permission. But anything that's a big transaction or anything that's kind of important, we get a pop-up. Or, like two-factor authentication, we get a text message or an in-app message saying, do you really want to do this?
Yeah, that makes
And
sense.
that's the kind of approach you do.
Yeah, and that would be areas where you need people, right, to be probably doing those bigger, whether it's transactions or kind of more risky things, right? That's where,
like on a trading floor,
Yeah.
If you're running the trading floor in London or here in Dubai, you probably don't want the agent to be,
Yeah.
running around with an unlimited
Fair.
kind of budget.
Yeah.
You probably want it to be very controlled. And it'd be the same. Yeah.
No, that makes sense. So there's been a lot of buzz about DeepSeek from China.
Yeah.
What exactly is it?
Sure. So I said right at the start of this conversation that AI is a piece of software that imitates humans. And ChatGPT, DeepSeek, these are LLMs, or large language models. What they do is they've been trained on all the information out there in the internet, online, and they've ingested all this information, and they work out patterns, and they know if this letter or this word happens, and this comes after this. And these machines, these LLMs, these models have been really expensive to train and build. And what DeepSeek, the reason DeepSeek was such a sort of quote-unquote wake-up call is two things. One is part of this new generation of models that have been trained on fewer variables, that have been trained on fewer, they're cheaper to train, they're cheaper to build. I think that we've forgotten that there's no kind of monopoly on intelligence or innovation. And that was maybe a wake-up call, because the stock market in the last few years has become very heavily dominated by a small number of these amazingly successful giant American companies. And so we almost kind of forgotten that really cool stuff can be built around the world.
So to that point about, there not being a monopoly on intelligence or innovation, bringing it closer to home to where, where we are
Middle East,
right
Africa,
now, Middle East and Africa.
Yeah.
I'd love to maybe take UAE as an example.
Sure.
How are countries here, this part of the world, how are they strengthening their efforts to be, leaders in this space?
I maybe mention two or three things here for the UAE. One is the UAE leadership has been very forward focused about new emerging technologies. This is clearly a global trend or global phenomenon. That said, the UAE leadership has, so I've been based in Dubai and the UAE since 2016, and it's been a noticeable feature that they've been very much keen to see what's coming around the corner, whether it's by doing investments in companies in the US or elsewhere in the world, whether it's by hosting events, setting up conferences. And we've seen quite a lot of that recently. And now when it comes to AI specifically, there are a couple of things to mention here. One is these models, large language models, so language, right? Language is different in every part of the world. The culture, we're all speaking in English now more and more, but every part of the world, including the UAE or the Middle East, or, we don't need to mention the 54 countries plus territories in Africa, but that every part of Africa is different. And so there's no one African model, there's no one Middle Eastern model. And it's really a good thing, I think, for humanity that there are governments and companies all over Middle East and Africa trying to build things that are local specific. Because otherwise, we're all going to end up in a world where basically the west coast of the US and the east coast of China tells us what to think. That's not such a fun world. It sounds like kind of gray world.
Yeah.
So the UAE has been building Arab language models. They've also been investing in some of the leading models in the US. So I think that's a good thing.
So you mentioned Africa. I'd love to talk about how, I think when we look at traditional infrastructure, Africa has been able to leapfrog some of that traditional infrastructure, right? By adopting technology. I'd love to hear a bit about how you see the continent adopting AI.
Yeah.
And what are some use cases in emerging markets?
Yeah. So the half glass full version of this is exactly what you said, the leapfrog element. And there are lots of really good case studies in financial services of Africa being way ahead of what used to be called the developed world, which is a very loaded term. But I mean, everyone knows about M-Pesa in Kenya, right? But M-Pesa was truly revolutionary. M-Pesa meant that everyone, it's about 20 years ago, it actually started as a science experiment. M-Pesa started as an overseas aid project from the UK and Safaricom, the biggest telco operator in Kenya, and Vodafone from the UK. And originally, it was a small group of people who were like, maybe we can use mobile phones to do lending or something. And they began to trial it. And what happened is the users, so the regular, the Kenyan people who were using the phone were like, no, this is not about lending. I can use this to transfer value. I can use it to take, do payments. And that became revolutionary. And this is like almost 20 years ago.
Wow.
A little bit later on the other side of the continent in Nigeria, you have something more state-driven called NIBS, Nigerian Interbank. It's basically the interbank real-time payment system. And I remember looking at this 7 years ago, 6, 7 years ago. I was in Nigeria one summer working on a transaction, and that was really interesting. I mean, this has been going now over a decade, and when you tell people Nigeria's had real-time payments, they're like, because technically it's only now I mean, if you obviously are a Citi client, you've got real-time payments in the US, but you don't have nationwide real-time payments in the US until very recently. And so there are lots of these case studies like, Nigeria, Kenya, other countries of leapfrogging. Now, AI is a bit more of a challenge because building models, as I said before, requires, even when you can do it more cheaply, like DeepSeek, it does require a lot of investment. And the challenge, if you're in Africa, whether south, east, west, is do you have models that are built for your community, for your country, for your region, your language? Do you have the application layer, the kind of client interface layer that's built and designed for your market? So I have a dear friend, former client of mine in London, Citi client. He went home to Ghana to build his kind of dream fintech. And one of the things he realized is when he went back, a lot of the off-the-shelf products that were available for fintechs in the US or the UK, he couldn't use. Why? Like, simple thing was many of these third-party tools or software tools assumed a kind of on-the-ground experience that was London or New York. Things like many of his clients didn't have a street number.
Yeah.
So he was like, how do I... And he had to build everything from scratch. The half glass empty thing is, if he had set up that fintech in the UK 10 years ago, whenever, it was about 10 years ago he started, I think 8, 10 years ago, he just literally messaged me today because he just announced a new funding round. He'd have been so much bigger by now because he has all the off-the-shelf tools. And he had to like literally build everything himself, or almost everything himself. And the same is going to, and that's a challenge in any new technology. The same way AI is, to have the application layer or the model layer that's really designed for me, my part of the world.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be the case.
Yeah, that's there. Yeah. Well, I would love to end on a optimistic.
Let's be positive.
What's most exciting to you about what's happening in this space with agentic AI?
So for me, agentic AI and AI is just like the latest part of this multi-decade unfolding trend. Remember I said earlier in this conversation that when banks were set up, many of the banks that exist in America or in the Western world today were set up about 150, 200 years ago. And they were set up during industrialization. So first wave of industrialization, late 1700s, early 1800s, second wave of industrialization, shortly thereafter. They're linked to the steam engine, and they're linked to other kind of big disruptive forces. And the railways come, and a lot of the companies that were set up then, or the banks that were set up to service those companies, were set up to service the 0.1% of the population. And what AI does is it brings to the 90+% of the population that what used to be only available to the 0.1. And it's the same whether you live in South Africa or Morocco or the UAE. It's kind of same trend.
Yeah.
And that's what excites me about AI. Democratization is a terrible overused phrase in fintech and financial services, but this will help it'll give people access.
Accessibility is not
Exactly. Yeah. And that should be hopefully net a good thing. Also, if you're young and you're growing up now, you grew up with all these tools. So the transition, it's less scary. I think if you're a bit older or you're very set in your way of doing things, this is going to be a challenge. It kind of reminds me, I always use the analogy, the kind of anecdote of my first job at Citi was to use mobile phone, because my MD didn't know how to use a mobile phone. So I had to call the trading floor with a mobile phone. And, and hey, he gave me a job to do.
But meanwhile, my kids, 1.5 and 4, they know how to use my phone.
And the amount of information they learn from YouTube and other video sources. Yeah. If used properly, it's amazing. They have so much content they learn. And it's kind of truly global content as well. Back in my day, I used to go to a library and take a book out to learn that. Yeah. And hopefully AI will just make that kind of education process just even more fun and entertaining and interesting. I always say that, like, I was on another podcast recently, and they said, give me a word, like a word that's in jail that we don't use anymore, that you'd like to take out of jail. And I said the metaverse, because the metaverse got misused as VR. But the idea of metaverse as hybrid, as basically, I want to learn about how a plane or the combustion engine works, or like, what does Mars look like, the surface of Mars. I'll be able to see it, I'll be able to feel it. And a mix of AI and mixed reality is a better word than the metaverse. It's going to make education so much more fun. Yeah, and immersive. For our kids. Yeah. I love that. Immersive, exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you for chatting with me, Ronit.
Thank you for having me.
If you haven't yet, make sure you download Citi's GPS report, Agentic AI, Finance and the Do It For Me Economy. I'll include a link in the description below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on our conversation and Agentic AI. As always, feel free to drop a comment in the comment section. Until next time.